Just a reminder, we invite you to turn your videos on if you're willing and able, to introduce yourselves in the chat where you're coming from. And also you can rename yourself, share your name with your pronouns. So I am Renee Mazurek, and I'm a team member with the Urban Waters Learning Network. And this is building community leadership as an anti-displacement strategy. This is a peer call that's hosted by the Urban Waters Learning Network Equitable Development Collaborative. So who is the Urban Waters Learning Network? I suspect that a lot of you are familiar with us, but if you're not, we are a team of 4 people. I think I see most everyone on the call here, except for maybe Maria. I think she had an appointment, but there's myself, Diana Toledo, Adi Nocher, and Maria Brodeen. And we are co-coordinated by the River Network and Groundwork USA, and we're supported by the EPA. So you can see in this diagram, our network members include nonprofits, collaboratives, learning institutions, and as well as the 20 designated Urban Waters Federal Partnership locations. So from conversations with the network over the years, many years actually, topics such as climate resilience, gentrification, displacement have come up over and over again. And so for the last few years, we've been creating and sharing resources that are related to these issues, and specifically taken a deeper dive into the topic of gentrification. I've recently heard this term greentrification or green gentrification and displacement and anti-displacement policies. And so that is where this Equitable Development Collaborative came from. In 2020, we convened a group of leaders to form this Equitable Development Collaborative. So we have Alicia Smith from the Junction Coalition in Toledo, Ohio, Daniel Wiley from the Ironbound Community Corporation in New Jersey. We have Arthur Johnson from the Lower Ninth Ward Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development in New Orleans. And we have Liz Buyouts, who is, among other things, the ambassador for the Lower Passaic River Urban Waters Federal Partnership. So in this collaborative, we've formed a circle of shared leadership and mutual respect, and we've had lots of meaningful conversations on the topic of environmental displacement. And that has led us to this conversation that we're having today. So in a little bit, Arthur will talk more about how anti-displacement applies in this environmental setting and what this specific call is about. But I want to share that the Urban Waters Learning Network, it strives to be holistic in our approach, recognizing the intersectional nature of the work that we do. And it involves the community and the environment, and not just the environment, but there are social implications as well. So there is a great new article by Charles Lee in the Environmental Law, Environmental Law Review, that discusses environmental justice. And the real way that we get this done is if we're all at the table, multi-sector organizations, political, community, and multi-sector meaning not just environmental organizations, but housing organizations and all the different kinds of intersections that there are. Right, so that's the collaborative. Before we get into this, I want to take some time for our acknowledgements and agreements and practices. And I saw some of you doing this already in the chat, and thank you for that. I am here in Asheville, North Carolina, and I am on ancestral lands of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians. And if you do know that and you would like to share, go ahead and put that in the chat as well. And if you want to learn more about this, this is a great resource right here, this map, and the link I think we'll probably share in the chat as well. I also want to take this time to recognize and acknowledge the anti-Asian violence that happened not too far from here in Atlanta this week. And just to really recognize that over the last year, violence against American Asians and Pacific Islanders has risen about 150%. I call this out, I condemn it, and these actions are unacceptable. So I mentioned that as our collaborative, we have formed a circle. And so these are some of the agreements and practices that we've been using with each other. And I want to extend this out to you as we expand our circle here today. So we listen with attention, curiosity, compassion, and without judgment. When we speak with intention. And I want to kind of pull out from that, this one at the bottom as well. Sometimes when we are well-intentioned, we still have a harmful impact. And so want to remind us to consider our impact. And if we say something, oops, is a good way to acknowledge, I shouldn't have said that, or ouch is a good way to say, I wish you hadn't said that, that feels harmful. Ask for what you need and offer what you can. Practice the pause. This one to me is like, sometimes someone will say something that is really important, and in order for us all to hear it, it's a good idea to just stop, maybe take breath and listen to what has been said. And that contributes to the well-being of the group. The other thing related to practice the pause is, take space, make space. As if you're used to saying a whole lot, maybe just sit back and listen. And sometimes if you're not used to saying a whole lot, we want to hear what you have to say. So these are some of the acknowledgements and agreements that we've used in our conversations together. And that's what I wanted to share in the structure that we'll be using today. I'm almost done talking, I promise. Before I pass this over to our moderators and our collaborative leaders, we do have a polling question that Deanna is going to launch here in a moment. And that is, to what extent is your community experiencing displacement pressures due to gentrification? And so take a little bit of time here to think about that and then to answer this question.
Okay, we have about half of the folks have responded already. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. All right, I'm closing it in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
Okay, so wow, nobody here said not at all. About 27%, it's in the horizon and anticipate it to be happening. About 19%, a small number of residents and local businesses are getting pushed out, and 54%, so overwhelmingly over half, a significant number of residents and local businesses have already left. So this is real, this is what we're dealing with, and that's why we're here today. Thank you for answering the questions. And now I will introduce our moderators. So let's see, we'll start with Liz. Elizabeth Buyouts graduated with a Bachelor of Science from the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences at Rutgers University. She has served as the AmeriCorps New Jersey Watershed Ambassador for the Hackensack River Watershed, has worked with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection's Office of Water Resource Management and Coordination, and has worked in the private sector as a site remediation consultant. She is now the Lower Passaic River Urban Waters Ambassador as part of the Urban Waters Federal Partnership, and is also the outreach coordinator for the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Estuary Program. We're so happy to have Liz here with us today. And we've also got Arthur Johnson. He was born in the nation's capital, but his roots are in New Orleans and date back to visits with his grandmother who lived in the lower Ninth Ward. He earned undergraduate and graduate degrees from the George Washington University and the University of the District of Columbia, then relocated to New Orleans in 1999, where he has established himself as an accomplished fundraising professional and nonprofit leader with a number of educational institutions and nonprofit organizations. As CSED's Chief Executive Officer, he is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the organization and works closely with staff and volunteers to advance CSED's key initiatives focused on food security, the natural environment, and the built environment. So at this point, I am going to pass the mic, shall we say, to Arthur Johnson. And as Arthur is introducing us to this topic, there are a couple of questions on the slide here that you can share your experiences in the chat. And at any point throughout, please share your questions within the chat. We will be watching those and we can come back to them throughout. All righty. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm glad that you could be here today.
Great. Thank you, Renee. This has been great. Again, I'm Arthur, and you know, it's so important as we look at what's going on in our communities, and particularly in today, things change on a instance by instance basis, way more than it used to, or at least that we were aware of how the changes are coming about. When we look in our community and we talk about why is this topic important, I think the poll that was just taken gives a very good indication why it's important. We are seeing changes within our communities, and that's every community, particularly the underserved communities and the communities of color, where, again, changing on what's important, what's significant, and where we are being placed, or how those placements are impacting our whole quality of life. Then let us not forget the pandemic that we're constantly in. And then sometimes it's complicated. You know, we face with how do we deal with all of these changes that impact us. So the pandemic is one. It impacts our total quality of life, not only our health, but how we live, you know, how we will exist, from education to recreation, to economic development, to jobs, to housing, to communities. And how do we keep those communities viable and vibrant in dealing with these disasters? And so this is why we're here today. We're here to look at that, to hear from our colleagues, experts on some placements that they have within their own domains, to talk about that and see how it relates to you. And what is equitable development? That's, you know, we have a definition. It's the role of community education and leadership in advocating for equitable development. Well, equity is, again, another one of those terms that is being kicked around in so many different places and so many different domains today. And it means sometimes different things to different people and who you talk to. But we know that, you know, equity is so important as we look at how we place our role and the work that we do and why we do it. And particularly in the nonprofit world, where we're faced with so many different challenges every day and from different people. And sometimes these challenges change because of what is going on in our own environment, you know, politics, even recreation. You know, we talk about the sports teams, the professional sports, and how they fit in, and then who's to be held accountable, and where does that play a role in equity? So we want to share your questions and experiences in the chat as well. What would you like to get out of this call? What are specific ways that you are already working on this? And as you see in the slide, you know, we see that social, economic, environmental, all interactive, and sustainability, which is in my organization's name, becoming more and more important. How do you stay around to be able to make a difference on that basis? So the role of community education and leadership in advocating for this in our communities is so very relevant. And this is what we're going to examine today and listen to and hear and react. And we're doing this as a discussion as we continue to hear and how we express how we feel and what is going on in our communities, in our own domains around this country, to know that we're not in this alone, no matter where you are, whether you're in the North, the South, the East, or the West, and how that plays a role. And there's a lot of similar interests and similar challenges going on today as we continue to examine this issue. So as we look at, we're going to start. I'm going to pass the baton to Liz, and we're going to introduce our speakers for the day with their case studies, and this will start our discussion as we continue to move forward. Liz?
Thanks, Arthur. Thanks for that. Renee, I think I'm gonna just take away from your slide the practice suggestion, right? Like take a moment to pause and just reflect on all of the great stuff that's being added in the chat, and to kind of just give ourselves some time to absorb all of the wonderful things that Arthur just said. I myself added in the chat that I'm looking forward that, you know, in the next hour, we're really just going to be listening on what these three wonderful people are doing to keep residents in their communities. But I also welcome for everyone else that's joining us during this call to share those experiences and to share all that wonderful work that's taking place. Because there's strength in numbers, and I really look forward to just listening to see what's being done locally in your own spaces to keep pushing all of this great work forward. So I'm really excited to hear from you guys all as well. And then, like Arthur said, I do have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. So I will start with Daniel Joseph Wiley. Daniel is a lifelong resident of Newark, New Jersey, where he works on housing policy in Ironbound Community Corporation, advocating for both housing and environmental justice in the East Ward of the city. So thank you, Daniel, for joining us today. We're excited to hear from you. And then following Daniel, we will hear from Iris Gonzalez. She is the founding coalition director for the Coalition for Environment, Equity, and Resilience, an advocacy collaborative working on environmental justice policy solutions in the greater Houston region. We're looking forward to hearing from you, Iris, as well. And last but certainly not least, we will also hear from Kate Derrickson. She is an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society at the University of Minnesota, and is the co-director of the CREATE initiative. So all very wonderful speakers, and we're looking so much forward to listening from all of you. And so, like I said, I think Daniel will be the one that's kicking us off. Daniel, whenever you're ready, please take it away. Oh, I think Renee, you're sharing the screen, correct?
Sure thing. Thank you, Liz. Yes. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Daniel Joseph Wiley. I'm the Housing Justice Program and Policy Manager, Ironbound Community Corporation, lifelong Newark resident. Currently, we've been on occupied Lenape land in the state of New Jersey. So yeah, this is an old presentation that I did about 2016 at the Rutgers University. I was speaking in front of students, but I think it's still relevant to this day because it does touch on why we're doing the work in Newark around anti-displacement and anti-gentrification work. So you can go to the next slide. So just for context, the Ironbound population is about 50,000 people. It might be a little bit slightly over that now. This was done a couple of years ago. So I want to say it's hovering between that 55 and 60,000 at this point. Our average household income is a little bit over 51,000. 75% of the residents in Ironbound are renters, and citywide in Newark, I believe it's 78% of Newark residents are renters, which is an astounding number. And it's something we see across the nation too, in cities just like Newark. All right, you can go to the next slide. This is a map of the Ironbound. It sits in the eastern section of the city. It's also known as the East Ward. Ironbound, some locals, we call it down neck because it sits at the neck of the Passaic River. The Passaic River is something that flows from the Hudson River. But yeah, so this is broken. We broke, these aren't official. We just broke this down just so we have a sense of what we see as a community organization and how we have dividing lines. We see the dividing lines. So North Ironbound is North Ironbound and South Ironbound are the closest to our downtown section. This is where we're seeing most of, the encroachment from downtown coming into the neighborhood. Most of the displacement are happening in these areas as well. Central Ironbound is pretty much our business district. This is the main attraction for Ironbound. This is where we have, most of the people come here for our restaurants, et cetera. So, we haven't seen a lot of development in this area because it's so congested and a lot of the lots there aren't available for development. And also Newark has very strong rent control laws and a lot of rent control buildings. So pretty much, folks in that area are pretty much, I don't want to say they're set, but, they have a lot going for them as far as anti-displacement. East Ferry or East Ironbound is the area we are most concerned about. That's the area I grew up in. It's environmental justice neighborhood. It's surrounded by a lot of industry, including an incinerator, which is, in walking distance to about 12,000 residents. This incinerator burns tons of trash. Yeah, I'll just say that. And most of it not coming from Newark, and a lot of it coming from, the outside suburbs and also New York City. And then you can see that white part. It's actually supposed to be blue or maybe brown at this point, but that's the Passaic River. That is pretty much the reason why we are in a position that we're in right now, as far as working on displacement work. Across from us is a town called Harrison. Harrison has had a development boom within the last 5 years. You can see Cape May Street and Crucible Drive right across the river. Red Bull Arena is over there. Those are all high-rise luxury buildings right now. Red Bull Arena was the first thing we saw there. From there, we saw the old industrial buildings being knocked down or renovated into luxury buildings where rent is starting at, for studios, that 400 square foot studios are starting at about $1,900. Also, this is all transit-oriented development. The PATH train from New York City runs into Newark. Newark is the last stop. Harrison is the second to last stop. And you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so we were talking about the Harrison development and downtown development. Downtown development in Newark around Penn Station. Penn Station is our transit hub. It's the third busiest transit hub in the nation. And we're seeing swaths of development in that area, everything from high-rise luxury to new businesses that are moving in. I lived downtown Newark for about 5 years in one of the new developments at an affordable rate, just an asterisk. But it was interesting to see, I was in the beginning stages of downtown development. We were one of the only buildings down there that had residents in it. But now you're starting to see, the amount of development that's happening down there and how it's moving into the North Ironbound, which I tried to illustrate there. And then, of course, what I talked about before, the Harrison development, how that's impacting us as well. You can go into the next slide. So yeah, so this is what I'm talking about transit-oriented development. We call it the development path, and it's based on the PATH train that runs from Lower Manhattan and Midtown Manhattan into Newark. There's 4 or 5 stops on that train actually, but you can see in the last 25 years how it's impacted the rents. When Manhattan was going through its gentrification, years ago, we started seeing in Hoboken. Hoboken is about 4 square miles, but it's some of the highest rents in the nation. These were from 2017, so you can see the average rent there at that time was $3,255. Jersey City, but in the last 5 years, it's just changed dramatically. With average rent there right now is a little bit over 2,800. Harrison, which we've mentioned, is 2,100 or 2,200 at this point. And then Newark is, average rent is $1,550. So that's pretty much remained the same in the last 5 years, especially now with COVID. We're seeing actually rent prices drop, but we are seeing a lot of people that are moving from New York City, especially Brooklyn, to Newark because of the low prices in rent and because of the amount of new development that's coming in. And you can go to the next slide if there is another one. Yeah. So again, this is why we're worried. because of the riverfront development on the other side, we, we're starting to see it creep into different parts of the neighborhood. But in our riverfront on the Newark side, 10 years ago started the plan for the Riverfront Park, and Riverfront Park in Newark was a big deal. It was the first public park that was going to be built on the river. We never had one, and this was a community process, the community ownership over it through planning to, and the step-by-step process of actually finishing it as well. But what we saw is once the park was finished, then we started seeing changes to zoning in the riverfront area, where it went from like 3 stories up to 5 stories, which is significant if you see the area, if you walk down there. But also the threats to our public housing in the East Ferry or East Ironbound area started to happen. In 2013, which I just got off a phone call last night with the NAACP about this, is Terrell Homes, Miller E. Terrell Homes, which has been under threat of demolition since 2013. The Newark Housing Authority has done everything possible to try to shut that place down. But we have wonderful tenants down there, a tenant association that are not going to leave. And, they not only are they holding us accountable to stay in a fight with them, but they are really pushing the city and the state, actually at the federal level now with HUD, to ensure that, those there are 271 units down there are preserved for affordability. And it goes back to the average rents in the East Ironbound area, which sits at the riverfront. Average rents down there are just a little over $1,000 for 2-bedroom apartments. So it tells you, the affordability down there is under threat. There are a lot of developments that are looking into the area now. There are some zoning changes that they've proposed. Fortunately, they haven't gone through yet. We're in a fight with that right now. But it's going to be a constant battle. And we're one of the groups that, we're not seeing displacement right now. But, we know it's on the verge. But also, other things that we've worked on, and I'll end it with this, is that, yes, somebody put Liz, there is a documentary on Terrell Homes. Actually, I'll put something in the chat. It's going to be screened April 6th. But things that we've worked on, in the last 5 years, which, ICC has been in the room for, are some tools for the toolbox to stop displacement in our areas. And, one of those things is we've strengthened our rent control ordinance. Our rent control ordinance is one of the strongest in the nation. We have an inclusionary zoning ordinance, which sets aside 20% affordability for anything over 30 units that's going to be built with density. One of the most progressive in the area, at least, being that the affordable units can be awarded at both the planning and zoning board. And last but not least is right to counsel. And Newark was the 3rd city in the nation. We like to joke that it's the first broke city in the nation to get right to counsel passed. And this gives tenants, low-income tenants, access to counsel in landlord-tenant court. So these are all things that we have in place right now. They're not perfect, but at the same time, they are progressive, and they're making an impact right now. It's not stopping developers from coming in, but I think it is it's at least giving some pushback for as how they're going to develop. We've seen 2 large-scale developments stop already because of our inclusionary zoning, where developers weren't going to get the yield that investors wanted back, so that was stopped. So there's some some stuff there, and there's organizing is rough for all the organizers in the audience. We all know this. Organizing is rough, and it's going to be a long road ahead. But I think we're prepared with the policy that we put in place, and the tenant leadership that we're working with. And I think that's the last slide, right? Oh, well, these are just numbers of this is from 2017 was the latest. This is the amount of development that's come into the Ironbound and the amount of units. You can see it was a hotbed for folks. Most of these have been passed. Very little have put the shovel in the ground yet, which is something that we're also flagging, because most likely these means that developers are getting their projects passed and then flipping them to other developers, when the time comes. Then you go to the next slide if there's another one. Yeah, so this is just a the development pressures and health stuff. So of course, rent increases, inadequate infrastructure. We want to make sure that any affordability that is built to the standard of both, the same thing that luxury is getting. There's public safety measures, there's landlord pressures. That's why, right to counsel came into place. We're paying attention to foreclosures. Zoning changes have happened, but we've been able to make sure that the zoning changes, are applied to our affordability as well. So meaning like our inclusionary zoning, any zoning changes that happen in the city have to apply to our inclusionary zoning. So that means affordability has to be put into those zoning changes. Of course, public housing threats, which I covered. I put public safety twice. For what reason, I don't know. It was a big issue at the time. And then this isn't for me factor, which is, and I'm sure most of you know that live in areas that are going through gentrification. When something new is built in cities like Newark or low income cities, communities of color, when those things come up, unfortunately, most residents see it as this isn't for me. And that leads to just so many other different issues. And then the solutions, the tools in the toolbox, which are the policy that we've worked on in the last 5 years, which we're very proud of, and they're working, which I think is something that's great. All right, and then that's it. I'm looking forward to questions later.
Yeah, I think I was looking in the chat to see if anyone had any questions for Daniel, but it looks like we can move on to our next speaker. So Iris, if you want to go ahead and start your portion, that'd be great.
Great, thank you, Liz. And thank you so much for this invitation. And I also just want to express gratitude for the intentional way you've set up this conversation and this space. I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Iris Gonzalez, or Iris Gonzalez, and I'm the director of SEER. We're based in Houston, Texas, and we're a collaboration whose mission is to raise awareness of the connection between pollution, place, and the public's health. If you go to the next slide, you'll see we're a collaborative of 27 nonprofit organizations. And these organizations are listed here. They really come from a few different sectors. One is the environmental justice space, also the social justice space, and we bring together really mainstream, traditionally white-led, green environmental groups, some of whom you might recognize here, with organizations who really enter this conversation through the lens of civil rights and community organizing and power building. We also have folks that work on housing justice and folks that work on transportation justice. And so we're really pleased to have a broad set of coalition members around the table. And it's very unusual that that these groups come together and that they sit at the same table and that they stand up for one another. We're also supported by our academic partners, which I think we can talk about later in the Q&A. But this is SEER. If you go to the next slide, we are about 3-ish years old. We were born from the storm. We came together after Hurricane Harvey just over 3 years ago. And when we introduce ourselves, we always introduce the values that guide our work. And so for us, some of the things that are really important to hold in any conversation is that community residents are experts. People who are living these issues are experts in their lived experience. Their lived experience is data and is expertise. We also believe that innovation requires those diverse minds and those diverse voices around the same table. We also put people over profits and know that all communities deserve flood protection and nature-based solutions and other work that's happening. And then lastly, we talk a lot about the need to examine our history, to know where we've come from, to understand right now, and to hold the past and the present as we imagine our future. So that's just a way of introducing us. And if your organization has not put down your values on paper, I encourage you to do that. Next slide. So So I mentioned Hurricane Harvey. I think, for us, this issue of gentrification and displacement and green investments can't be separated from climate change and from the climate crisis, and thinking about climate gentrification and climate migration and climate refugees. And so I want to kind of focus a little bit on our work around that and what's happening in Houston around that. Hurricane Harvey, for those who might not know, was an unprecedented historical event. Over 50 plus inches of rain fell. The National Weather Service had to make a new color to be able to measure on their map how much rain this was. And Hurricane Harvey also brought a lot of pollution, a lot of emissions, because Houston is the energy capital of the world. We have the highest concentration of petrochemical facilities in the country, in our region. And when Hurricane Harvey hit, there was a second storm of pollution of nearly 8 million pounds of pollution, extra pollution, that hit us in just a couple of days, which is normally what we get in an average year. Most recently, about a month ago, we also experienced an unprecedented freeze that some of y'all might have read about in the newspaper, that brought our entire electricity grid to a screeching halt. And so I mentioned this because, these quote unquote once in a lifetime events have happened now multiple times in our lifetime. And these acts of God, these unprecedented events are really our normal, are really what we're facing. And it's important that we examine the language we use to talk about these events. And for us, it's what I've described, but I know that these are happening across the country, right? Wherever you are, whatever region you're in, you're also facing your own climate shocks. So I think, these events bring a lot of suffering. There are still hundreds of thousands of families in Houston that don't have access to running water and that are still recovering from what happened a month ago. If any of you are interested in supporting one of our coalition members who's helping to repair pipes, I'll put their information in the chat. But I think these events also create an opportunity, right? They really shake us and rattle us and create new appetite for conversation that maybe was not politically viable before. Next slide. The other piece of this is that these events really amplify and multiply what already exists on the ground. And so some of the inequities that we experience here in our region is this repeated recovery from these disasters. And as Dr. Robert Bullard from Texas Southern University and his extensive research has found, the pattern is that money follows money, money follows whites, and money follows power. And so as we continue to experience these events, these disparities and these gaps are growing wider. And one of the solutions that really are needed is investment, but equitable investment, right? And so this map on the left, I know is really tiny, but if you look at this map on the left is a representation of where we are right now in terms of spending for flood protection projects. And the areas in green is where our flood control district has about 50 or more % of funding ready to go. And the red and orange areas are our watersheds where we currently have 50% or more unfunded work that's been promised to the community, but where we don't have resources to get it done. And these are the watersheds that have been historically disinvested. These are predominantly Black and brown watersheds. These are downstream watersheds. And even after we sourced local money to pay for some of this work through a local bond, we're still leaving these folks behind. And so really important to understand what this legacy has created and the conditions that we experience, and that we need to find different solutions to really bring investment in a more equitable way to protect people. Next slide. So one of the, within that context, one of the things I wanted to just share about today was some of the buyouts. So Harris County is the third largest county in the country. We have had a pretty active voluntary buyout program for a number of years. But in the middle of last year, in the middle of a pandemic and an economic crisis, our county introduced a new mandatory buyout program. So this is the first mandatory buyout program that they have introduced. And there were a lot of issues with it, and many of the families who are impacted by this buyout, which touches 8 different neighborhoods and 2,000 people, almost 700 homes, really live in those red areas that were on the previous map. That's who's being bought out. 86% of the people who are impacted are people of color. And so a lot of concerns, a lot of frustration, and really just chronic failure on behalf of our systems and of our elected leaders. And so this is a story, I can link this in the chat too, but this is a story of Dolores Mendoza, who her family has lived in the neighborhood that's being bought out for 6 generations. Her great grandparents met in that neighborhood. And, our communities live next to each other, right? So everyone, all of those generations are in that footprint. And so, she talks a lot. If you sit with residents like Dolores, they talk a lot about the development that's happened all around them, and the disinvestment that's happened for them, and how that has created the conditions that they experience today. How flooding happened after apartment buildings were built, after green spaces were taken away, after development happened all around them. And in Houston, we don't have any zoning, and our city has also grown by annexing other cities. So we've kind of swallowed up whatever was there. So all of these things contribute to this pattern of disinvestment and these inequities all around her. And so some of the things when we worked with community members, some of their demands were around being led into the decision-making process, being led into the design process, right? Show me the data that you're using that says that I am hopelessly in the floodplain after you failed to protect me from this crisis. We want a seat at that table. And also this idea of the acknowledgement of human rights as a core essential part of the program for a family like hers, offering a heritage value, or offering some sort of financial compensation for the fact that her family has been there for 6 generations, right? And they have stakes and they have roots in that place. And then lastly, being able to really understand, being able to influence the community engagement techniques that are used, especially in these communities where English, putting a link on a website, sending somebody an electronic survey, making everything only available in English is just not even close to good enough. And so being able to make sure that there are people who are most impacted that are sitting at that design table to design community engagement as well. I think I have one more slide. So one of the solutions that I wanted to just mention, which touches on a bit of displacement, but also just on this idea of equitable investment and equitable development, is that we on the 2-year anniversary of Harvey lobbied for an ordinance, a resolution rather. Our county doesn't have ordinance making power thanks to our state government, but our resolution called the Harris Thrives Resolution passed in Harris County on the 2nd year anniversary of Hurricane Harvey. And part of the resolution called for creating a task force that could really be the place to have some of these difficult conversations and to really serve as an accountability body for looking at how investments are taking place, looking at how programs are being designed and implemented, and bringing in multidisciplinary partners to think about these problems in a holistic way and to be solving at the intersection of issues and at the intersection of problems, because we don't have the luxury anymore of solving, in a silo and in a vacuum. And so this has kind of just happened. The task force was just established earlier in March, and represents, will be made up of 17 members. 11 of them are either directly impacted community members or organizations that work closely with impacted community members. But we also have engineers, we have health experts, we have academic experts, we have environmental experts, really bringing together a diverse set of voices. And their role is to be an equity body and an accountability body, to make recommendations and to really be a set of eyes and ears that's following the money, that's asking the hard questions, and that is reporting directly to our county commission on how it's going. And I think that it's important that that we have these places to really have these conversations and to create space for unlearning and relearning, right? The engineers we work with are not trained on equity, right? That's not a part of their formal training. And so there's a sense of vulnerability that needs to come from our public sector, and a real unlearning and relearning that needs to happen. And so this task force will be carrying out equity and racial justice trainings, equitable flood development, thinking about how we address climate change, how we think about buyout programs, and making sure we're not concentrating displacement in communities of color. All of those things will be coming from this task force. So hopefully in another year, I'll have some excellent results to share with you all. But I wanted to lift this up as one of the solutions that we're working on in Harris County.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Was that Iris's last slide, Renee? Great. So it doesn't seem that we have too many questions on the chat. So I just want to encourage folks to make sure to add your questions as our speakers are presenting, and we will have our discussion after our last presenter. So with that being said, Kate, do you want to lead us off?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Daniel and Iris, for that. That was really great to hear about what you've been working on. I have a lot of slides, but I have promised that I'm going to stay within my amount of time. So what I'm going to do is just really kind of go pretty quickly to give you a taste of what the CREATE initiative has been working on. And then you're going to be able to gain access to all the materials if they're interesting to you, or we can have further discussion about it in the chat or in the question and answer. So the CREATE initiative is an initiative at the University of Minnesota. It is a tremendous acronym that I did not come up with, called Co-Developing Research and Engaged Approaches to Transforming Environments. And the impetus for the establishment of CREATE was to establish what I would call the front door to the research university, to figure out how we could mobilize the resources of the research university to ask and answer questions that are a priority to the communities that have not historically shaped our research agendas. And so it's premised on this idea that the ways that we make knowledge, the research questions we ask, those are important for the kind of environmental futures that we bring to bear. So we established, you can go to the next slide, the policy think tank as our first step. And these is comprised of folks, some of whom you may know, like Nataki Osborne-Jelks, I think is maybe familiar to some of you. She is the director of the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance and a faculty member at Spelman. And these are folks that I had worked with for years in different capacities. And we asked them to work with us to identify a series of research priorities. So you can go to the next slide. And we established with them this idea of investment without displacement. So how can we promote climate adaptation, healthy watersheds, and green amenities for everyone? So really, trying to get at this kind of honestly perverse intersection between communities, especially in Atlanta. We'd worked a long time in Atlanta, who, you are all familiar with, experience environmental injustice advocate for improvements and then get displaced as a result of those improvements. So is there a way to ensure that the kind of green futures that we advocate for are for the folks who have been dealing with the injustices that can benefit from them? So you can go to the next slide. And so one of our collaborators, Darlene St. Clair, who is a representative of the Dakota community that we were working with, said, how do we get out of these ruts that we seem to be in? And what she was getting at there was a reflection in the conversation that, you know, all different kinds of tools have been used in the kind of arc of urban development. And they seem to consistently result in white communities getting a disproportionate amount of investment in environmental amenities at cost to communities of color. And so even though green infrastructure and kind of climate adaptation strategies feel like something new, our policy think tank asked us to situate those historically so that when we think about climate futures, when we think about environmental justice, when we think about greening cities, we understand that we're not doing that kind of even starting at a baseline. We're doing that in a context, in a history of racialized exclusion and dispossession, and in a context, especially in Minneapolis, but certainly throughout the country, of kind of white supremacy. So what would it look like to think about climate adaptation and greening future green cities that doesn't reproduce this dynamic that we understood ourselves to be in? So you can go to the next slide. So we took two paths forward. So the first was to create a policy toolkit that we called Sharing in the Benefits of a Greening City. And this came out of the recognition and realization that a lot of the agencies that we were working with, like the Park Board and the Pollution Control Agency and all the organizations with which you will all be familiar, just didn't have the language around displacement, around gentrification, around white supremacy, around some of these urban planning tools. And so there was like this huge gap. So it was a real burden for our community partners to have to constantly educate these agency actors in terms of what we were even talking about with respect to green gentrification. And so they asked, could we make something that was public facing, that would both educate agency partners and collect best practices or existing strategies for resisting green gentrification. And so that's what we did. And this toolkit exists in material form, and I can send anyone a copy who wants a copy. We printed a lot of these right before the pandemic. So I've got a bunch in my closet if anybody would like them, but you can also access it online. And there was a question in the chat about tenants' rights organizations. There's how to establish them. And that's exactly what's in this toolkit. So you can go to the next slide. I'm just going to go through these like really quickly. So there's a bunch of concepts. You can go to the next slide. And then here's an example of a page out of the toolkit. I'm really resisting the temptation to just hold it up and show you because I know that won't be helpful. So, so it's describing, it's sort of plain language so that you can talk to agency partner and say, this is what we mean when we're talking about real estate speculation. So it's explains some concepts like gentrification, green gentrification, and so forth. You can go to the next slide. Next slide. And then it has some policy tools, different kinds of policy tools that folks have been using. We do not have the toolkit in languages other than English. Thank you for asking. And I thought about that when you were during your talk, but maybe we can talk about that. Next slide. And then it also has some strategy. So it also has some worksheets and strategies that break down the different kind of pros and cons or kind of techniques of using different approaches. So you can go to the next slide. And then there's some information about different forms of organizing. I'm afraid when you click through these, it might highlight a whole bunch of different things. So you can click quickly through them because normally when we give this, we spend a lot of time sort of showing what the different dimensions are, but I think you can get a sense. So you can go to the next one. And again, here's the one on tenants unions. You can go to the next one. And then there's this supposed to be, you know, and then there are some things, oh, you can go back to, I must have repeated community land trust by accident, sorry. So yeah, so then there's there's some tools at the back that are for community organizations or for anyone who wants to use these to think about, to foster some thinking about and organize some thinking around which kinds of tools would be most useful when you're looking at a project. So in Minneapolis, for example, they're looking at a massive redevelopment of some land that's near the Mississippi River. And there are a lot of, you know, it's all under the rubric of greening the city. This is an industrial site that's going to be now this kind of beautiful green park and amphitheater and all that, but there's a lot of concerns about, you know, its proximity to low-income communities of color and how that's going to impact them. So we were thinking with that community in particular, as we were designing these kind of anti-displacement matrix and a project-based evaluation. So that's the toolkit. I wanted to share one more, I have 60 more seconds. What is the best thing to share in 60 more seconds? If you could go a couple of slides ahead. More to here, okay. I'll just say that the second thing that we're doing with CREATE is a research-based initiative to look at how do we understand past investments so that we can think about, you know, sustainability studies folks often think about baseline and then future. And we are trying to show that in fact, the kind of geography of the Twin Cities is shaped by things like redlining, things like racial covenants. And if you go to the next slide, and the next slide, sorry, lots to talk about, but I will end it in a second. This is a map that's showing that racially restrictive covenants and their inverse of redlining is highly correlated with the location of the most desirable green amenities. So here what we're trying to do is complement work that highlights the way in which environmental justice has focused on a lot of environmental justice research has focused on proximity to environmental hazards. And we're trying to foment a conversation about the way that there's also this dynamic in which there's a correlation between investments in green infrastructure and green amenities and racialized exclusion to the benefit of white communities. And so we're trying to look at something like a Green New Deal or Biden's new massive infrastructure investment proposal and say, we have got to think very carefully about the way past investments in infrastructure have resulted in disproportionate wealth and well-being for white communities, even when they were purportedly race neutral, so that when we think forward about greening cities and we think about forward about green infrastructure, that investment has to be not only not racist, but anti-racist. And our sense is that we've got to better understand, or perhaps from an academic perspective, better communicate that history so that we don't repeat it and we can remediate it in our future investments. So I'll stop there. But clearly lots of stuff that we're doing at CREATE that I am really excited to be in conversation with you all about. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
That was very impressive to get through that many slides in such a quick time. So Arthur actually does have a couple of questions that we'd love to not just hear from our speakers on, but also if anyone that's joining us today also has any feedback on, we'd love to hear it. But before that, there are just a couple of questions on the chat that I want to sent your way. So Kate, since you were just the most recent presenter, there was a question from Ethan and specifically about the booklet, and that's maybe like, is there some type of version that perhaps organizations can have so that they could translate it themselves, perhaps? I don't know if you have any feedback on that.
I don't have I don't know what to say about that. I think that it's important and useful, and I would love to hear suggestions. I think maybe making it editable is a great idea. It's got a little bit of a case of arrested development because it was launched into the universe, like I said, in late February of last year, and we were really anticipating being in dialogue and further developing it, and then we all know what happened. So I think I'd love to hear if for folks who work with communities that do not speak English, is making it editable a helpful thing to do? What would be a useful technique? So definitely interested in thoughts on that.
Awesome. And just a reminder for folks, if you'd like to speak, please be sure to use the raise hand feature. Renee's monitoring all that great stuff so that we can call on you if you want to voice your question or your comment. And then Diana also had a question. Let me go back up to it. She was interested in hearing more about how we could work a little bit more with HUD, since it's not an agency that a lot of us have any experience with or much experience with. So this is open to everyone, but I think she specifically wanted to hear Daniel's response on it. So maybe Daniel, we can start with you, maybe.
Yeah, sure. Can you repeat the question? I missed the tail end of it.
Sure. So from Diana, Daniel, can we talk a bit more about how to work with HUD? It's not an agency that many of us have an experience with.
Sure.
So maybe on how to promote affordable housing and how to collaborate with them a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. And that's a great question, because HUD is definitely, because they're a federal agency, it's hard to maneuver the system they have in place. But most regions have a HUD office. Of course, that's, it's a matter of accessibility, because in our region, a lot of things are based out of New York City, and we're 12 miles outside of Manhattan. We have access there. We also have a regional office in our downtown area. So again, pretty accessible. But yeah, I think, that's one thing, like how close are you to the regional offices? The relationships with that office are important as well. Luckily, we have so many people in our city that are housing advocates, and great ones at that, and a long legacy of outstanding housing advocacy that, those relationships have been built for the past 50 years, where if some of the residents or ourselves as an organization need help with that, there's always somebody we could reach out to. But to answer your question, I would say look into your regional offices, especially now with the new administration. I think those will be more accessible, and the intention to preserve some of our public housing and affordable housing nationwide, I believe, is on the table now. So it might be easier to access those offices in comparison to what was happening in the last 4 years.
And that also, folks may also want to look at or reach out to their either state or federal representatives to try to help to maneuver through some of those bureaucracies on that basis, particularly when, at least in this administration, it appears there will at least be more favorable to listening to the community. But your state and federal representatives and their staff can help to expedite some of those maneuvering through that basis.
Thank you, Arthur. Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Okay, Liz. Well,
I think we have another question from Hannah, actually, okay. Arthur. Yeah. So Hannah's curious about the development of Tenants' Rights Association. And I think maybe this was added in there during Daniel's presentation too, but I know Kate and Iris both might have mentioned that a little bit too. So open to anyone who may want to answer that question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, if anybody else wants to, I didn't hear the question again. I'm sorry.
No worries. So Hannah's curious about the development of tenant rights associations. And here's her comment. For a mid-sized city, I'm shocked that we don't have one. And so she would love to have some background on the history of how they're structured.
Oh, great. I'll be quick if anybody else wants to jump into, but our organization is part of a national organization as well, which is Right to the City. and right to the city. They work on tons of housing policy, but through that we were able to foster Homes for All satellite group in our city, which has been going on for the last 4 years now. That helps it. It's a great resource nationally, but citywide. Again, this is way before my time, but folks have been advocating in our city for so long that we have Greater Newark HUD tenant coalition. All of our public housing sites have tenant associations. As an organization, we have our monthly community meetings, which are comprised of different resident buildings, and those kind of happen organically, where tenants come together and work on tenant rights and stuff like that. So it's a mixture of past organizing work and just new organic actions that happen in the community for us.
And then I just want to note that Kate did have a comment that it's actually also in the toolkit. So for those of you who want the hard copy, be sure that you email her so you can have access to that information. But I believe Kate also mentioned that it's available online, correct? So folks can just directly access it. Great. Okay, so Arthur, why don't you kick us off with the additional questions that we have for our wonderful presenters today?
Okay, well, we'll start this. And again, I want to thank all of our presenters, Daniel, Iris, and Kate, for just overwhelming amount of information as we look at, this issue. And, some of the things that I kind of picked up, so that may generate questions out there, as we look at gentrification and realizing that gentrification 2021 may be a little different than gentrification in the past in relation of how we have to look at it and how it fits in. It really starts to expand the truly quality of life issues that include housing, but not limited only to housing and what that means in our communities. The underserved, we know that they're impacted, and that underserved group of people in all of our communities around this nation, as we've seen, it's severe, and it's alive and well. It's not, hasn't gone anywhere. Research is a tool, as Kate has mentioned, and I think we have to look at our research entities, universities, and institutes alike to reach out to them and help them to be partners as we look at community and science research components being interplayed as we look at this issue. And so as we kind of talk about and have talked about this, moving forward, knowing what the power is, I throw out to the group, what do you see as power bases as we kind of attack and address these issues of gentrification and displacement and political maneuvering? So I throw that question out to our speakers. Anyone? Everyone?
Yeah, this is Iris. I can jump in. I think it's one of the most fundamental questions of this work. So it's a big one, but I think for us, it's been about really gathering an unusual set of voices and organizing across neighborhoods, across communities, across language, but also across issues. And, if we're asking our decision makers to solve for multiple problems at once and to understand these issues in the context of history and in the context of how they intersect with other, other sectors, then we also have to be showing up in that way, and we have to be modeling that behavior. And so, doing that is really easy to say and very difficult to do. It requires deep relational organizing and deep relationship building and meeting people where they are. And when I say that, I mean community, but I also mean within the nonprofit landscape and within the academic space and within, the sort of institutional organizational level. it takes real relationships, and those take time, and those require trust, and that also takes time. And so, I think for us, every time we gather, every time we come together is an opportunity to model and create the kind of world that we're asking for. And so, so we're very intentional about how we set up our spaces and how we have those conversations and how we call in our traditional green groups who get really uncomfortable when we talk about the political strategy, or the talking about white supremacy, or naming the racism. And so it's about the hand holding, it's about the hair pulling, it's about the sitting with people and holding them accountable, and building that trust. But I think it's also about getting involved in electoral work. We put on a number of electoral and voter education events. We regularly host candidate forums. We put out candidate questionnaires. We put on events to educate voters about what's on their ballot and how it connects to these issues and what they care about. And we capture stories to be able to really demonstrate how policy can improve or can continue to harm people and what they care about. So I think it requires just putting yourself out there and having the members around the table who can engage in that space, and knowing that if you're coming up against conflict, you're coming up against some hairiness, some discomfort, you're headed in the right direction. You're actually doing it right.
Thank you, Iris. Would any one of the other speakers?
Yeah, Kate actually has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Kate?
Okay.
I'm not sure I know how to unraise it, so I'll figure that out after. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that comes to mind with your question is how expertise and research needs to be reworked. And somebody asked the question, what is anti-racist green infrastructure? And I don't think that, and I was thinking a lot about Iris's point about people being experts in their own experiences and the need to really elevate the voices and visions of folks who have not had the opportunity to shape how our cities develop and our infrastructure develops. At the same, and my experience with my community collaborators is that they want research. They just want to decide what that research is about. They want it to be about the questions and concerns and priorities and frameworks and scales and places and categories that they think are important to inform their own decision making. And my dissertation research was on post-Katrina redevelopment in Mississippi, and it was really striking what a disadvantage my collaborators were at when they couldn't do they didn't have access to the resources that other people had to model changes in the watershed. And so they really needed research to think about, what do we want to see happen in our watershed? And we want to see different scenarios. If we go this way, what do we think will happen? If we go that way, what do we think will happen? So they really needed research. They just didn't want it to be about them. They wanted it to be for them. And so when I think about this question of expertise and kind of anti-racist approaches to green infrastructure, I think for us at Create, it really starts with that question about how do we make ourselves a resource to get behind the expertise of our community collaborators, rather than being experts about what kinds of green infrastructure we need to see. Figure out, lower my hand.
And one of the things that someone mentioned, one of our speakers talked about the, data analysis and basically documentation of the information. And I think that's important. And that's, I think, where our academics, our universities can help to play a role within the community of documenting that information and documenting what's happening in the kind of, emphasizing the research. And I would also say, in your communities, look at all your universities. That's also your historical HBCUs, historic Black colleges and universities there as well. They also do a lot of great research, both from social science, but also from natural science and environmental. We worked with 2 universities in Louisiana, Grambling State and Southern University, in working on a white paper about the Mississippi River as part of a component for with the group looking at restoration of the Mississippi River. And we got them involved, but the group never really thought about them until they started getting the information and research. So don't leave that out as we talk about how to fill those gaps in. But we know that there are gaps, and so, like Daniel, what do you see as the some of the gaps that can be filled that either you've used or that can be used to help bridge this void that we're having with gentrification and displacement within our communities?
Sure. Thanks. I think Kate and Iris, they touched on everything basically, but I think, as organizers and people that are on the ground, research is big. One of the things that we try to set the intention when universities or students or anyone that's doing research wants to come into Newark and write reports. We ask that, their intention is to pick up on the nuance of those conversations. Because a lot of times what we do see is that, a lot of things that are reported on are things that, some of our residents have been talking about for 20 years now. And they're just being reported now. So that's something that we pay close attention to. But I think the other thing is, and this is a great quote, it's not my quote. I was at a conference a few years ago, and the question came up about, changing the narrative. And one of the panelists said, it's not about changing the narrative, it's about changing the narrator, and who's telling these stories and who's the expert in the room, saying the things that are actually going on in the communities. As myself, I have to check my privileges on a daily basis, when I'm in the room with folks, even though I grew up in the neighborhood and I've dealt with, some of the similar issues, when it comes to public housing, like I say this all the time, like I could tell you everything that's wrong with public housing. I could tell you what needs to be done in public housing, but I don't live in public housing. So it's not my place to speak for someone. Those folks that are living that experience 24 hours a day are the experts with that. So I think that's the biggest thing is, the voices that are telling the story should be the voices that are, going through it. And it goes back to the nuance of the conversation and picking up on that. That's about it.
And then Iris, I can see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Totally agree with what Kate and Daniel just shared. I think, for us, academia and research are important ingredients and tools in the work. And we know that there's also a history there of some of those relationships being extractive and benefiting research and benefiting academia. And some of what, Daniel just shared of kind of helicoptering in or showing up or, wanting, sometimes with very good intentions, right? Often with very good intentions. But I think that the best case scenario that we have found is really, that's also a relationship that needs to be cultivated and nurtured. And we have that with our local HBCU. And it also came to making sure that we defined as a coalition, what does that relationship really look like? What is it that we need in order to make this a mutually beneficial and where both parties have power and where we're not extracting from community, like what does that actually look like? And so we put together a set of guidelines. And I don't know about other organizers on the call, but this last summer, with the uprising, with the national reckoning, with the heightened attention on an issue that has been happening, we had a lot of folks approaching us. We had people coming out of the woodworks saying, we want to do this. We want to apply for this grant. We want to do this. And it's also about, in any relationship, right, setting your boundaries and defining what success looks like in that relationship. And if the other party is for real about taking a bottom-up approach and really living and practicing equity, then you can work through that together. And that, again, takes time and takes dialogue. But I'll put in the chat some of the guidelines that we developed that are on our website. Just as a starting point, a lot of them are borrowed from the 11 practices of community-based participatory research that already exist if you Google that. But I encourage folks to really define, to put on paper, what does that mean to us, and how are we going to work together in a way that's going to protect and lift up and really be in service to community. And I think the last thing I'll say, research helps to validate and legitimize lived experiences, and the other way around, right? Lived experiences help to legitimize and validate the research. So the arrows go in both directions.
Thank you, Iris. Well, Liz, we're getting close to wrap up time. We've got room for maybe one more question.
Yes, we do. I think we have enough time for two. And I just wanted to be sure that I presented our speakers with this question because I might have glossed over it earlier. But Mo Kinberg asks, how can you make sure that investments in green infrastructure are anti-racist? Would our speakers have any answers on that? I think Kate touched in on it a little bit during her presentation, but curious to see if Iris or Daniel have any thoughts on that too.
I have one little thought. I don't know, Daniel, if you want to go first.
No, go. Yeah, I'm sorry.
The thing that came to mind when I read that question was a tool that the City of Austin sustainability team created. When right now they're in the middle of updating their climate action plan. And they have partnered with the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, GARE, to provide monthly equity and racial justice trainings, and to also help them as a municipality, as a government, understand how racism has impacted their decision making and continues to impact their decision making. And so from that process, they created an equity tool that actually takes every single strategy that's named in the climate action plan, has to go through this equity tool that puts on a chart, what is the legacy of this issue, and what is the context that this strategy is sitting within, and then measures with numerical value. Is it having a negative impact? Is it having a neutral impact? Is it having a positive impact? And so, nothing is written or makes it to the final version of the climate action plan unless it's gone through that tool, and unless it actually can demonstrate an impact. So that's just one example that came to mind when I read that question.
Yeah, and mine's just a quick example. I was gonna say, in Newark we have our Riverfront Park, and that was, we wanted it to be an equitable process where the folks that are actually living in the community had their say, and it started off that way. But now we're seeing that since the city sees it as a economic driver, all the things that are being added to the park now, like a full beach and like restaurants and stuff like that, pretty much are going against what the community asked for. So I think that's the bit. An equitable tool, like what Iris just mentioned, I think is important. But the thing is, the sustainability of those tools, has to be enforced. Because it starts off with promise for the community or the existing community, but eventually when folks find out that this is an economic driver and it's something that raises the tax base in certain areas, it can go the total opposite.
Great, thanks, Daniel. So we have one question in the chat we wanted to bring out to ask. Alicia asks, how do you ensure equity in service and funding during these times? Let's start with Daniel.
I'm sorry, you're gonna hate me, but no, I was getting a phone call to say, what was the question?
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm sorry. What was the question again?
The question was, how do we ensure equity in service and funding during these times?
Ooh, actually, I'll pass that to somebody because that's something that might, I'll be brainstorming in live and right now, so and thinking out loud. So I'd rather somebody that can articulate it a little bit better. Maybe
Iris, okay.
try that out.
Iris?
I mean, a good question. It's also, I mean, I think as many of us have, you know, participated in lifting up and have been reading about others lifting up, this moment is just shining a light and amplifying what we already knew was there, and really underlining and highlighting the work that we have been doing. And so, you know, I think things like disaggregated data to understand, you know, things like where are sites for vaccination, where are sites for, you know, for access to different healthcare services, you know, all of those things are really important. So asking for the maps and for the data and for, you know, don't just tell us, show us, prove it, right? Give us the map, give us the information. So I think those kinds of requests are really helpful to kind of follow what's happening. And then I think something we hope the task force is going to also help create our tools to track those investments, to really define, you know, who is it that we consider our environmental justice neighborhoods, and who is it that we consider our frontline neighborhoods. And when we come to make decisions around where money is going to be invested, let's actually follow that money and track what is the percentage that has been invested in those communities, what is the percentage that has been invested in other communities, what is the total percentage that's actually going to the front lines. And again, to have it on paper, on a website, you know, in a chart, unequivocally something you can point to and follow. And so I think a lot of times in this work, the folks who make decisions and who have power say and articulate that they're powerless, and they're not. And this is a way to really make sure that they get it and that it's tangible and that they can show and not just tell, and that they can see how they can be a part of actually interrupting those patterns.
Thank you, Iris. Kate, do you have comments?
We are actually right at 2:30. So and this happens to us every time. I know our collaborative can agree. We always run out of time on these conversations, and it's because these conversations need to continue. And it's my hope, I think it's all of our hope, that you go away from this call today and do continue having these kinds of conversations with your community, with your own networks, and with people that you work with, because it is a really important discussion to be having. So I just want to take this a last minute to thank our amazing collaborative leaders, Liz and Arthur, who helped to moderate this call, to our speakers, Daniel, who's also a member of our collaborative, Kate and Iris, and to all of you who have come and been in attendance here today. Deanna has shared in the chat box already the link so you could register for our second peer call that we'll be having about community wealth building. It'll be similar to the setup of this one, with a couple of speakers on that topic. And also take a minute to fill out the evaluation form. The last thing that I wanted to tell you about today is that we have a mobilized group, which is kind of like it's an online communication group that we formed, that is exclusively about equitable development and environmental spaces. And we share resources and can continue to have some of these conversations there as well. So if you're interested in being added to that group, go ahead and drop your email address in the chat box and I can add you directly. One thing to know about that is that joining that subgroup, you will also be added to the larger River Network online community. That's about 400 people from around the country that are also discussing and talking about water and water issues and different things as well. So yes, please, I see a bunch of you dropping in there, add to group, and the email addresses, keep them coming. I will just one more slide. This is us, this is the Urban Waters Learning Network. If you have any questions, you can always reach out. We are happy to talk with all of you. And thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to everybody. Thank you for coming and sharing the space with us all.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.